Nashville, Tennessee. In 1997, a serial killer is preying on restaurant employees. He leaves no clues and tries to murder all witnesses. Prosecutors work with homicide detectives to identify the murderer and end his killing spree, while a terrified community wonders where the predator will strike next. Tennessee Assistant Attorney General Tom Henderson worked with other prosecutors and local police in an intense search for an elusive and vicious killer.
He was void of any emotions. He wouldn't kill you or kill me without a reason, but if we had a dollar he wanted, he'd kill us for it, and without any thought or without any remorse.
At noon on February 16, 1997, police responded to a seafood restaurant in a suburb of Nashville, Tennessee. They had been called by the restaurant chain's district manager. He was concerned because the restaurant hadn't opened on time. No one had answered his phone calls, though an employee's car was in the parking lot. No employees seemed to be inside. The restaurant's safe was open and empty. So was the cash register. Police hoped it had just been a robbery. Then, they discovered two bodies, dead from multiple gunshot wounds. Officers called in an apparent double homicide.
Medics, crime scene search unit.
The victims were employee Sarah Jackson, a 16-year-old high school junior, and store manager Steve Hampton, a 25-year-old father of three. Nashville Metro Police homicide detective Pat Pastiglione responded to the scene.
When I arrived, what my job is, after I interview the initial detectives, is to perform what they call a walkthrough. I go with the ID techs and we go through the entire crime scene. In this particular case, what struck me was that the crime scene was not what we call a typical crime scene, if there is such a thing. This crime scene was very clean. The place looked like it was ready to open at any minute. The tables were all neatly arranged. It was not your typical ransacked type crime scene.
Police determined that both victims had been shot in the head, execution style. 12 total shots had been fired. The brutal efficiency of the crime indicated an experienced criminal was responsible.
The person that did this probably has done the same thing in the past, in the way the crime scene was left, the fact that the business was locked, delaying discovery of the victims, and the cold-blooded nature in which the victims were killed.
An audit of the cash register receipts revealed that $6,000 to $7,000 had been taken. Forensic technicians processed the restaurant, recovering dozens of latent fingerprints. They would be compared to known prints of employees in an attempt to uncover foreign prints, perhaps from the killer. The only sign of disarray was a trash bag on the floor.
Underneath the trash bag, we found a shoe print, and we knew that that shoe print was made prior to the bag being placed there. And we know that because the store was clean and mopped prior to that, and both victims' shoe prints were eliminated from that particular print. So we knew we had something at least to go on.
The size of the print suggested it had been left by an adult male. The crime scene indicated that the victims had not put up a fight.
There was nothing to suggest that the victims resisted in any way, shape, or form. I think that's the part that upset us the most when we got to the crime scene, was the fact that these young kids did nothing other than cooperate with this man. He still felt it necessary to eliminate them, in our mind, as witnesses. And that's exactly what he did.
The two witnesses inside had been killed. But then the detective noticed a security camera on a nearby bank building. It was pointed directly at the rear entrance of the restaurant. If the killer had run out that way, his image might have been captured and an identification could be made. Detectives requested the bank's video footage for review. While detectives checked on the bank video, a medical examiner performed autopsies. He extracted several .32 caliber slugs from the bodies of the victims. The slugs were sent to a ballistics lab for further examination. Detectives hoped the bank's video footage would give them a suspect. But they soon found out the camera had been undergoing repairs on the night of the double murder. They hoped another lead would surface soon. The lead came quickly. On the day the bodies were discovered, a man walking along Ellington Parkway noticed identity cards in the grass. They were for the children of Steve Hampton, the store manager who had been killed. It was just a few miles from the crime scene. The man contacted police, who responded to the parkway.
We fanned out across Ellington Parkway and we walked 3.1 miles all the way down, and we found 7 or 8 items belonging to Steve Hampton. Library cards, insurance cards, driver's license, movie rental cards. As it turns out, the person that committed the robbery was throwing these items out along Ellington Parkway as he drove.
Investigators hoped the cards would yield physical evidence.
And we were fortunate because on the movie rental card, we found a portion of a thumbprint, a right thumbprint.
Examiners compared the print to those of Steve Hampton and his family.
We felt comfortable that the print probably belonged to the suspect. We know it didn't belong to the victim or anybody associated with the victim that we knew of. So our hope was this print belongs to the killer.
Ballistics examination might provide another link to the killer. Examiners compared the .32 caliber slugs recovered from the victims. The lands and grooves etched into the surface of each slug indicated they had been fired from the same handgun. If detectives recovered a weapon, examiners might be able to link the slugs to the gun. Going over the ballistics and autopsy reports, the detective noted the suspect had emptied his gun and reloaded. The use of such force against compliant victims indicated they were looking for an exceptionally dangerous individual.
The type of person that clearly has no conscience, the type of person that's just cold-blooded and cunning, and that's what we think we were dealing with. Somebody who's able to talk themselves into a business, slick enough to get inside the business and convince the people, even at gunpoint, that if you do what I say, everything will be okay.
Hoping to develop more information, detectives questioned 3 teenagers who had worked at the seafood restaurant the night before the murders. They recalled that just before closing, a man had come by the restaurant looking for work. He was wearing an apron from another restaurant chain. They gave him a job application and said he should come back in the morning to see the manager, Steve Hampton. The teenagers didn't know if the man had come back in the morning, but detectives found evidence that he did.
As it turns out, we have another witness located the following day, the day of the murder. She sees a tall male white standing out in front of this business with a white piece of paper in his hand, speaking to Steve Hampton. We suspect that white piece of paper was a job application given to him the night before.
The witnesses described the suspect as a muscular white male who might have had a slight mustache. Police canvassed residential areas and businesses near the restaurant, hoping someone would recognize the sketch. but no one did. If the man who met Steve Hampton on the morning of the murder was the killer, no one seemed to know who he was. Because the suspect had worn an apron from a restaurant chain, investigators did background checks on all 400 area employees of the chain. The background checks generated no new leads. A month after the murders, investigators feared the case was going cold. Then, just after midnight on March 23, 1997, Nashville police received a 911 call. The caller sounded injured, but before he could relay any details, the line went dead. The operator traced the call to a hamburger restaurant in an eastern suburb of the city and dispatched officers. Among those responding was Nashville Metro Police Detective Mike Rowland.
The initial appearance was everything was okay. Everything was locked up. There were a few cars in the parking lot. When they started looking through the windows, they were able to see a trail of blood and at least one body back in the back of the restaurant.
Police had to break through the restaurant's locked doors.
There were 4 victims at this scene. 2 victims were still alive and 2 victims were deceased. The 2 that were still alive, Jose Gonzalez and Andrea Brown, were immediately transported to a local hospital.
17-year-old Andrea Brown did not survive the night. Like the 2 other fatalities, she would die from multiple gunshot wounds. Her co-worker, Jose Gonzalez, had been stabbed 17 times. When paramedics found him, he had stopped breathing. They worked frantically to save his life. Investigators began to process the crime scene.
There was a large amount of blood. There were also what appeared to be a large amount of footprints in the blood. All through the back, the break room, the hallway, the office, the storeroom, there was pretty much blood everywhere on the floors.
Forensic technicians worked to determine if any of the blood belonged to the killer.
One thing that we would hope would be that the suspect might have gotten injured in some way and we would be able to obtain suspect DNA.
No discernible foreign fingerprints were recovered, and police found no murder weapon.
There were 25 caliber shell casings. We located all the shell casings. Some of them were obviously right out in the open. Some of them we had to get down under things and try to find.
A total of 6 bullets had been fired. A medical examiner retrieved bullet fragments from the victims and forwarded them to the Tennessee Bureau of Investigation Crime Lab. Examiners there determined they had come from a .25 caliber handgun. It was not the same caliber of weapon used in the earlier murders at the seafood restaurant. Detectives Bastiglione and Rowland learned the shoe prints from the 2 robbery murders did not match. Despite this and the difference in weapons, they believed the 2 incidents were connected.
This is 2.7 miles from the first business. It's pretty hard to imagine these 2 types of crimes happening in our city and they not be connected.
Investigators contacted Deputy District Attorney General Tom Thurman. He would help organize the multi-agency investigation.
At this time, a task force was formed. The police, again, obviously, very intense investigation, attempting to find physical evidence. Police felt they had the same suspect. It appeared that we almost had a maniac on our hands.
The task force worked quickly to develop information.
That task force consisted of several police officers on a full-time basis answering telephones with a specifically designed phone number that would pertain only to this case.
Police also set up an email address to collect every possible lead.
They were getting all kinds of calls they were having to chase down. We're checking out every lead possible. I mean, the lead books were just amazing how many calls they had and people reporting things.
As police continued their investigation, the only survivor of either crime was recovering in the hospital. When his doctors allowed it, a detective went to interview Jose Gonzalez.
Jose, what can you tell me about that?
As the only witness to the triple homicide at the hamburger restaurant, detectives hoped Gonzalez could help them identify and stop the killer. Gonzalez told them he and his fellow employees were just leaving the restaurant when a muscular white male forced them back inside at gunpoint.
What do you want? Get the money out of the safe.
Training his gun on them, he made the manager open the safe and put the money in a bag.
Hurry. I'm getting the money.
He also emptied the registers.
Move it. Down.
He then forced the 4 employees into the storage room and told them to lie down side by side. The killer shot the first 3 employees twice in the head. When he got to Gonzalez and tried to fire, his revolver was empty.
Suspect started backing up, and Jose, scared to death, he jumps up and tried to fight. During the fight, he was knocked to the ground and started feeling the sharp pains in his back and his neck, head. He went down and played dead.
The killer ran off. The last thing Gonzalez remembered was dialing 911. In the spring of 1997, Nashville police believed a single killer had murdered 5 people while robbing 2 restaurants. One victim of the second attack survived, having been stabbed 17 times. Police interviewed Jose Gonzalez in the hospital. Gonzalez helped police create a sketch of the man who nearly killed him. The drawing closely resembled the suspect in the first attack at a seafood restaurant. Detective Sergeant Pat Bastiglione had been working that case. He now teamed up with Detective Mike Rowland.
Sergeant Bastiglione and I began working real close together at that point. We knew that the restaurants were going to be connected. We felt really strong they were going to be connected.
Police increased patrols around the area's dozens of fast food restaurants. They couldn't predict the killer's next target.
Clearly the pressure was on. We were trying to locate this person before he struck again.
A month after the second restaurant killings, police received a 911 call from an ice cream shop in Clarksville, Tennessee, just outside Nashville. The caller said he had driven to the ice cream parlor to pick up his teenage sister after work. When he arrived, the front door was unlocked, but no one seemed to be inside. The cash register and safe were open and empty. When he couldn't find his sister, he called 911. Police found no fingerprints or signs of a struggle. They determined that 16-year-old Michelle Mace and 22-year-old Angela Holmes were scheduled to work that night. Michelle's brother said he had dropped his sister off at the beginning of her shift. She was working that day with Angela Holmes. Just before 10 p.m., Michelle had called for a ride. That was the last time he had heard from his sister. The incident might be related to the other attacks.
Anybody that you know might have came by, saw him?
But this time, there were no bodies. Detective Robert Miller of the Clarksville Police Department was the lead investigator on the ice cream shop case.
I guess you hope that it's not going to be a homicide. You hope that maybe the girls are going to be found the next morning, that maybe even if it is a robbery, that something, they've been placed somewhere, and that we're going to find them.
Those hopes were dashed the next morning when police responded to a call from Dunbar State Park, 3 miles from the ice cream shop.
There was a man walking his dog around 9 o'clock, 9:30, who happened to be on one of the trails around a lake, and he found what he thought was either a mannequin or a body just in the water's edge. And we got out there. That area was secured. The Tennessee Bureau of Investigations had a crime scene team that came down.
They found the body of a young woman floating in the water near the edge of the lake. Her hands had been tied behind her back with an apron, and her throat had been slashed. 170 feet away, off a trail in the woods, they found the body of a second young woman. Her throat was also slashed.
It did appear that it was going to be the two girls, Michelle and Angela. They hadn't been positively identified yet, but we were pretty sure that that's who we had.
Arriving at the park minutes later was District Attorney General John Carney.
By the time that I had gotten there, both of these girls' bodies were found. Because there had been a similar case in Nashville, Detective Pat Plastiglione from the Metro Police Department and other detectives actually came down to Clarksville, came out to the scene.
Autopsies confirmed that the victims were Michelle Mace and Angela Holmes. Police had a potential third case in the investigation of the restaurant murders.
I heard about 2 girls up at another fast food location up in Clarksville were kidnapped and murdered in the early morning hours. And we just froze and we said, please don't tell us this is going to be connected.
Actually, we'll go shop here.
Detectives from Nashville Metro and Clarksville compared their cases. In each incident, the suspect cleared the safe and cash registers. Then he tried to kill any witnesses.
The ones at the park that we found were the first one.
The detectives concluded they were dealing with a serial killer. Assistant Attorney General Tom Henderson was brought in from Memphis to help coordinate an investigation that crossed jurisdictions. To him, the vicious manner of the latest murders indicated the killer was more dangerous than ever.
Gun, you don't have to think long to pull the trigger, and it doesn't take long to shoot somebody. It takes a long time. It's not easy to cut somebody's throat. It takes a while. It takes grim determination to slit somebody's throat like this man did. It's not something you do in an instant. You have to consciously continue to do it for a period of time.
Perhaps the killer had left some trace of himself behind in the third attack. Examiners at the Tennessee Bureau of Investigation Crime Lab processed the apron used to tie one of the victim's hands. But the only DNA found on the apron belonged to the victim herself. Authorities held press conferences to ask the public for help.
We began to get an enormous amount of people calling in with information, so we started working on the leads. All said and done, probably close to 500 leads came in.
Police followed up on every call. But after several weeks, none of those leads had brought them any closer to their suspect. Detective Rowland and his team were worried that the killer had once again eluded them.
Everybody just kind of pulled together. Nobody was getting any sleep. We were working around the clock. And it's just an extremely frustrating situation.
Then 2 separate callers contacted police. They said they had driven past or stopped by the ice cream parlor around closing time on the night of the murders.
They told us that they had seen a red vehicle, some type of small red 4-door vehicle parked up near the door.
Anything real good?
Another witness placed a red car at Dunbar State Park on the night in question. Investigators now believe they had a critical piece of information about the killer. Authorities increased their media campaign, re-releasing the composite sketch of the suspect, along with information about his possible red car. No new leads on the elusive serial killer's identity came in.
Move it. Move it.
But soon the case would break unexpectedly, and the killer would finally surface.
Down.
In the spring of 1997, 7 people were murdered in Nashville by a serial killer who targeted restaurants late at night. Investigators believe the suspect drove a red car. Using the local media, authorities have been asking the public for their help. Soon, they got it. On June 1st, 1997, Mitch Roberts, the manager of a local family restaurant, spent a quiet evening with his family.
You expecting anybody?
He had an unexpected visitor.
Hi, Mr. Roberts.
He recognized the man as Paul Reed, a former employee.
I just wanted to explain to you what had happened. I have something in my car that'll prove that I'm...
Roberts had fired Reed 4 months earlier for fighting with a coworker.
Are you not with us some other time?
He was telling me that he was trying to get his life turned around and that he was sorry for what had happened to the store and he'd like to get his job back. And my wife said, "Could I speak to you a minute?" She said, "Who is this?" And I said, "Well, he's a cook that used to work for me that I fired." And she said, "There's something weird about him. Get rid of him." And I said, "Okay." So I came back and spoke with him a little more and kind of led him outside.
Reed told Roberts he had something in his car that would prove that one of his employees was stealing from the restaurant.
It was real dark, and we walked down to the drive, and it hit me instantly. It's a red car.
So,
Mitch Roberts had seen the reports about the alleged serial killer's red car.
And so I basically tried, to get away then, get back to my family inside the house. I said, "Well, Paul, you call me tomorrow, and I'll talk to you about it." And so I turned to leave him, and he pulled a gun and told me he was going to blow my head off. And I asked him what it was all about. I said, "Paul, if this is a joke, it's not funny." And he said, "This isn't a joke, I mean it."
I mean, I don't know what you want, Paul. I'm the one that gave you a job when you were out of work.
The terrified father tried to keep Reed calm.
Just go on.
And as I stepped up on the porch, I'm not ashamed to tell you, I said, "God, help me. I'm going to fight him on the porch. Tell me what to do. He's not going to get back in my house." I backed in the house and fell around the corner of the door opening in case he shot through the door. And he pulled on the door a couple of times trying to get it open.
Open this door!
Roberts pretended he had a gun nearby and yelled for his wife to hand it to him.
And he bought that story and ran. We got the wooden door shut and locked. I called 911 and reported it.
Me and the house. He aimed the gun at my
Cheatham
head and
County
said he was
deputies
gonna blow my
immediately
head off.
responded.
He says if I go out to his car, he can...
And I went over the story of what had happened and was going to press charges, naturally, for assault. It'd been about 45 minutes and the phone rang.
Hello?
And it was Paul on the phone.
I don't believe you're calling.
Reed said he wanted to apologize.
Well, you're probably about the last person I expected would have called you.
A deputy picked up another extension.
Yes, this is...
And when he got on the phone, he said, "Yes, Mr. Reed, I understand. I'm here with Mr. Roberts and his family. Everything is fine. You're not in any trouble right now, but we need to clear this up before tomorrow. And I think that's a good idea that you come back to his house and we'll do this." So when Paul drove back to the house, there were 6 deputies here waiting for him.
Reed was taken into custody and charged with aggravated assault.
Why are you doing this? Come around the front car. I haven't done anything.
The friend who drove him to Roberts' house was questioned and released. Recalling the restaurant's serial killer investigation, Mitch Roberts called the homicide department of the Nashville Metro Police.
And I talked to the police, Pat Pastiglione. The next morning I said, Pat, you need to come to Cheatham County. They've got Paul Reed in a cell. He tried to kidnap me last night, and I think he's the one you're looking for in all these killings.
Pastiglione and Detective Mike Rowland wanted to interview Paul Reed immediately.
Once he's arrested, we go down to the Cheatham County Jail. I obtain a color photograph of him, as well as a black and white photograph. We also get a good copy of his fingerprints.
No.
The two detectives questioned Reed before he made bail on the assault charge. Reed said he did not know the victims of the restaurant murders. He had never even been to the restaurants involved in the case. Then, the interview took an odd turn. Reed began making bizarre claims. He told Detective Rowland he was under constant government surveillance and that he was the subject of mind control experiments.
His demeanor was really strange. He kind of talked in circles, and I think at some points he was trying to act a little crazy maybe. It was a different interview.
The detectives returned to Nashville to check Reed's fingerprints against the partial thumbprint they had obtained earlier in the investigation.
We send him up to our ID technicians, let him match his fingerprints against the print found on the movie card that was found on Ellington Parkway.
A fingerprint expert examined comparison points on both sets of prints.
And match, we get a match, we get a hit.
The fingerprints proved that Paul Reed had been in possession of a card from murder victim Steve Hampton's wallet. Finally, District Attorney General John Carney had a suspect.
Paul Reed became a suspect. The Metro Police Department in Nashville began the investigation in conjunction with the Clarksville Police Department and actually developed enough probable cause to get a search warrant to search Paul Reed's home.
With the warrant, detectives responded to the boarding house where Reed rented 2 rooms.
We were interested in getting anything that may link him to this crime, any sort of forensic evidence, any sort of trace evidence. That would mean clothing that may have been worn by the suspect, shoes that may have been worn by the suspect, anything taken from the businesses.
Police removed 9 pairs of shoes from the suspect's rooms. They hoped one of them matched shoe prints recovered from the first 2 murder scenes. Inside Reed's desk, investigators found a credit card receipt from a gas station located about a mile from the ice cream parlor. The date and time on the receipt placed Reed near the crime scene at the time of the murders. Investigators also took samples of carpet and upholstery fibers from Reed's car and sent them to the lab for analysis. Detective Robert Miller looked into Reed's background.
We were able to find out that he was from Texas. He had been to Nashville off and on a couple of times, lived here working fast food jobs. He came here hoping to be a country music star.
Reed was also an ex-con who had served 6 years of a 20-year sentence for aggravated armed robbery and attempted murder. Police learned he had been charged with 7 aggravated robberies in Houston. Investigators asked Jose Gonzalez to come to the station. He was the only survivor of the fast food killer's rampage. He picked Reed out of a photo lineup. On June 25, 1997, Paul Dennis Reed was indicted by a grand jury for the execution-style murders of Michelle Mace and Angela Holmes. Reed told the press he had not killed anyone. Prosecutor John Carney had no doubt he could prove to a jury that Reed was lying.
We knew the case very well, and we knew our witnesses, we knew our evidence that we had in the case. I always felt confident that we could convict Paul Reed. I just felt so strongly that we had a good case and that we did not, the only important thing was that we convinced 12 people that were in that box that we had a case against Paul Reed and that he was guilty of the crimes that he committed.
But the prosecutor might not get that chance. Paul Reed's defense lawyer filed a motion asserting his client was not mentally competent to stand trial. If a judge agreed, there would be no trial for a man prosecutors believed was a ruthless serial killer. "39-year-old Paul Reed had been indicted by a Tennessee grand jury for 7 murders and 3 separate attacks on restaurants. 2 of the charges stemmed from the violent murders of employees of a Clarksville ice cream parlor. Prosecutor John Carney believed his case was the strongest.
Our case here in Clarksville had the most evidence that linked Paul Reed to any one of the cases. We had the most physical evidence directly linking him to both of these murders.
The victims, 22-year-old Angela Holmes and 16-year-old Michelle Mace, were found in a state park near the ice cream shop where they worked. Their throats had been slashed. Their violent deaths outraged co-prosecutor Tom Henderson.
Okay. What we're gonna do?
The first young lady he killed, we think he cut her throat from behind. And that caused the other one, of course, to run, but her hands were tied behind her back. He chased her down. You can just imagine in the dark, with your hands tied behind your back, having just seen your friend killed, knowing you're next, running through the brush, running through the trees, the sheer panic, the mental torment. She would have been able to feel her blood pressure dropping. She would have known she was dying and looked into the face of the man that was killing her.
Despite the severity of the charges, Reed's trial nearly ended before it began. His attorney had filed an 11th-hour motion claiming his client was not competent to stand trial. He suggested that physical and psychological trauma suffered as a child had resulted in the deterioration of his client's mental health.
Our response was that he may have had problems as a child, and we all had problems as a child, but that doesn't mean that you don't know what you're doing. You don't understand the difference between what's right and what's wrong.
After weeks of testing, psychologists determined Reed was competent to stand trial. Because of the heavy media coverage of the case, the jury had to be selected from outside Nashville. The Davidson County Public Defender's Office represented Paul Reed. His trial began in September of 1999. The prosecution's case began with a single slip of paper, a credit card receipt that placed the defendant near the scene of the crime.
Raise your right hand, please. You swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth? I do. Please proceed.
Paul Reed had a credit card that was used at a local gas station that was approximately 1 mile from the ice cream shop. And he had used that credit card approximately 6 minutes prior to their abduction. And we also had a witness in the case that fell in behind him as he pulled out of the local gas station and actually followed him up to the point that he passed the ice cream shop.
On cross-examination, the defense made sure the jury understood that the witness did not see the red car pull into the ice cream shop.
Drove out of the parking lot and there was this car ahead of me.
What kind of
The
car
car
was
had
it?
driven by without stopping.
It was a 4-door compact.
A second witness saw a red car pull into the parking lot of the ice cream parlor just as she was leaving.
That witness testified in court that they could put that car, the same color of car, at the ice cream shop at or around 1 minute before 10 o'clock at night when it closed up.
Very good. Now, could you tell
The
us what
defense
you saw
pointed
the
out
night
that neither witness could testify that they actually saw Paul Reed driving the car.
Could you raise your right hand?
The prosecution next called the brother of one of the victims to the stand.
Tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. Please be seated.
6 minutes after Paul Reed used a credit card to buy gas down the street, the young man arrived at the ice cream shop to pick up his sister, Michelle Mace.
As I arrived, I noticed all the lights were on, but nobody was inside.
His sister and her co-worker were gone. By 10 minutes after 10, he called the police. The prosecution contended that by the time police arrived at the ice cream parlor, Reed was already on his way to Dunbar State Park, where the victims were discovered. Prosecutors next focused on that second crime scene and tried to place Reed there. A young man testified that at 10:30 on the night of the murders, he and some friends saw a red four-door car parked at Dunbar Cave.
Could you tell
Again,
me what
the defense pointed out that the witness had only seen a car similar to the one Reed owned. He had not actually seen Reed himself. The prosecution had established that the ice cream parlor was the last place the victims were seen alive. Questioning a forensic specialist on the scene that night, the defense brought out a key point. None of the defendant's fingerprints or shoe prints were found in the ice cream parlor.
nothing to link the crime scene with my client?
Yes.
There was no forensic evidence to prove that Reed had ever been there.
Prosecution, like to ask specific questions? No, Your Honor.
Please be seated.
Prosecutors claimed they could prove that the victims, Michelle Mace and Angela Holmes, had been inside Paul Reed's car.
I am a forensics expert.
On the car in question, did you take...
Prosecutor John Carney called an expert in forensic fiber analysis, who believed fibers recovered from the victims matched those found on Reed's shoes.
There were 4 different fibers that were different and distinct from one another that were actually found on the victim's clothing and were also found on actually embedded into Paul Reed's shoes.
Thank you very much. Defense, would you like to prosecute?
To the prosecution, this was compelling evidence of Reed's guilt. On cross-examination, the defense asked if the fibers could have come from other cars. The fibers, she admitted, could have come from thousands of other vehicles.
I cannot say that, but what I can say is that it would come from a car exactly like his. It would have to be a car with the exact same upholstery, the exact same carpet. It would come from a car.
The fiber expert also confirmed that a team of evidence technicians spent 13 hours searching Reed's car, but found no hairs or fibers from the victims inside.
Match my client's car.
To the defense, this was proof that Michelle Mace and Angela Holmes had never been in the defendant's car.
No further questions.
Point by
Your Honor.
point,
Thank you.
the defense had countered the state's case against Paul Reed.
Thank you, ma'am. Be seated.
But the prosecution would next present forensic evidence that they hoped would prove conclusively that Reed was responsible for the deaths of the 2 girls at Dunbar State Park. In the fall of 1999, Paul Reed was on trial for capital murder in the deaths of 2 ice cream shop employees. Authorities believed he was a serial killer who murdered 7 people in 3 attacks on restaurants. At Reed's trial, the state called a DNA expert to the stand.
DNA profile.
Prosecutor John Carney questioned her about her examination of blood found on the defendant's shoes.
The things that directly linked Paul Reed to these murders were his shoes. Michelle Mace, his blood was found on the left tennis shoe of Paul Reed, and a mixture of both Angela Holmes and Michelle Mace's blood was found on the right shoe of Paul Reed.
Lead detective Robert Miller believed the DNA testimony would seal the case.
The defining moment of the case for me, we had a lot of circumstantial evidence as far as him being in Clarksville that night, being in that area that night, driving a red car, being seen by a witness that saw a red car on this particular roadway when there's not much traffic, and then slow down at the ice cream store. All of the circumstantial evidence was great, but when we had DNA proof, something that could not be denied by him, how much better do you get than you can say that you have the victim's blood on a pair of his shoes? And when we got that, I knew the case was solid, and I felt great.
Yes, I do, Your Honor.
But under cross-examination, the DNA expert admitted that she could not say with absolute certainty that the blood on the shoes belonged to the victims.
Are you considered a DNA expert?
There was a 1 in 2 million chance that the blood came from someone else. Prosecutors hoped the odds were enough to convince the jury. After calling more than 50 witnesses, the state rested its case. Hoping to cast suspicion on someone other than Reed, the defense called a friend of the victims who had been in the ice cream parlor shortly before 10 o'clock on the night of the murders. She testified that a man with long hair came into the shop that night. He argued with the victims over the prices and left. The witness said the man was very threatening. He did not look like Paul Reed. She testified that she left the shop minutes later, and Michelle Mace locked the doors behind her. That was the last time she saw either of her friends.
Thank you.
The defense hoped her testimony left reasonable doubt in the jurors' minds as to who committed the murders.
There's some things you need to know about my client's past.
If they had reasonable doubt, they could not convict.
Through an accident, he was hit in the head.
In closing arguments, the defense reminded the jury that the state's case was circumstantial.
He was found guilty.
They had not heard from a single witness who had seen Paul Reed with the victims.
My client in his youth.
According to the defense, the DNA evidence did not conclusively prove the victim's blood was on Reed's shoes, and the fibers on the victims could have come from a car exactly like Reed's. There was plenty of room for reasonable doubt as to Reed's guilt.
Can you sentence someone to death?
In their closing summation, prosecutors would have to tie the circumstantial evidence together.
And arguing
Assistant
a case
District
like
Attorney
this,
General Tom
you
Henderson
say
used a circle diagram to
circle
show the
diagram.
probability of Reed's guilt.
asking different questions.
We asked the jurors how many people were in Montgomery County the night of April the 23rd, 1997, who were familiar with the Dunbar Cave area, owned a small red car, needed money, had discussed robbery, had a knife, had car fibers that match, had aftermarket floor mat fibers that matched, had blood on their shoes, had human blood on their shoes, and had the victim's blood on their shoes. There's only one person in the entire world that matches all those, and that's the defendant, Paul Dennis Reed.
On September 22, 1999, Reed was found guilty of the murders of Angela Holmes and Michelle Mace. In separate trials, he was also convicted of the murders of restaurant employees Steve Hampton, Sarah Jackson, Ronald Santiago, Robert Sewell, and Andrea Brown. Reed received a total of 7 death sentences, 1 for each victim. Paul Dennis Reed was sent to death row at Brushy Mountain State Prison in Tennessee.